Get your filthy hands off the guests, you little ratchet. People like you are just vermin. You don't belong here and you never will. The voice of Richard Whitmore, the 45-year-old COO of the Whitmore Global Foundation, was a wet, slurring bark of pure, unadulterated privilege. He reeked of gin and an arrogance so profound it seemed to suck the oxygen from the air around him. He shoved me, Amara, hard, my thin server's uniform scraping against the cold marble pillar. A tray of half-full champagne flutes smashed to the floor, a sound like a small, sharp explosion in the polite murmur of the grand ballroom. Glass sprayed across my thin black shoes. Before this goes any further, I need to know what part of the world you're watching from. Comment your city and the time right now. I had been steadying an elderly donor, a man named Mr. Harrison, after he'd stumbled near the dais. My hand was on his elbow, a simple, stabilizing gesture. That was all. But Richard Whitmore, his face flushed with alcohol and a lifetime of unchecked indignation, saw something else. He saw a nobody touching a somebody. He saw a crime. "Don't you dare panhandle our donors," he spat, his voice carrying. The polite conversations around us faltered. He surged forward, grabbing my wrist. He didn't just grab it, his thumb dug into the radial nerve, a practiced, cruel twist that sent a jolt of white-hot pain up my arm. I am trained in counters. I am trained to neutralize threats. I could have broken his wrist in 2 seconds, but I was undercover, I was the help. I was invisible, I had to take it. "What is this cheap, tacky thing?" he sneered, his other hand fumbling at my collar, grabbing the simple silver chain around my neck. He yanked. The clasp bit into the skin on the back of my neck before it snapped. The locket, my mother's locket, fell into his meaty palm. "Did you steal this too?" He didn't wait for an answer, he threw me a full-bodied, drunken shove that sent me sprawling backward, my head narrowly missing the bronze edge of a planter, landing hard on my tailbone amidst the broken glass and spilled champagne. "Security," he bellowed, his face a mask of righteous fury, puffing up for the crowd. "Get this ghetto trash out of my sight, now." Richard Whitmore, a man who had never worked a real day in his life, a man who inherited his power and believed himself a god, saw a low-wage server. He saw vermin. He saw ghetto trash. He saw a nobody to be crushed for his own amusement, a momentary diversion at a boring party. He had no idea he had just assaulted lead investigator Amara Vance, badge number 4419, of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. He didn't know he had just committed felony battery on a federal officer. He didn't know I was the lead agent on the multi-agency task force, SEC, FBI, and the Southern District of New York, that has been actively and covertly investigating his entire family for the last 18 months. He had no idea that this catering job was the final piece of a deep-cover operation we'd been planning for 6 months. For 18 months, we had been circling the Whitmore empire. 18 months of dead ends, of sealed warrants, of witnesses who suddenly forgot how to speak. They were clean, too clean. Their lawyers, a phalanx from the most expensive white shoe firm in the city, were magicians. Their accountants were ghosts. Every digital file we subpoenaed was scrubbed. Every witness we approached was either paid off or too terrified to talk. They had built a fortress of plausible deniability. The $500 million they raised for their charities, for which they were being honored tonight, it was a black hole. We knew it was a massive money laundering scheme, a pass-through for political bribes, sanctions busting, and illicit gains, but we couldn't prove it. The paper trail was pristine, a masterpiece of financial deception. Until now, until this locket. This was the one thing they didn't know existed. This was my mother's ace in the hole, and now it was mine. We couldn't get in with a warrant. So I got in with a catering uniform. And the cheap, tacky locket he had just manhandled. The one he was now dangling from his thick fingers, squinting at it like a piece of garbage. That was my mother's. That was the locket belonging to Sarah Vance, the Whitmore Foundation's chief accountant, 15 years ago. The dearest friend of the family, or so they said. The woman who mysteriously died by suicide, thrown from her 12th-story balcony just 2 days after she told her 13-year-old daughter, me, that she was going to expose the family for monstrous crimes. That locket isn't just jewelry. It's a custom-made, shielded Faraday cage. And nestled inside, where my mother put it the day before she died, is a single encrypted microSD card. It contains the original uncorrupted ledger, the real books. The only piece of evidence that survived the official and corrupt investigation. The only thing that can bypass the 15 years of lies, cooked books, and paid-off auditors. It is the key to a $500 million racketeering and securities fraud case. It is the key to proving my mother's murder, and he was holding it. The ballroom at the Metropolitan Museum was a monument to this hypocrisy. $1 billion of performative wealth in one room, all gathered to save the children, or whatever slogan the foundation's marketing team had cooked up. They were celebrating a new $100 million donation from the matriarch herself, Eleanor Whitmore, the billionaire grandma, the beloved 80-year-old philanthropist who was, at that very moment, giving a tearful speech about empathy and community. I could see her on the dais, a frail, elegant figure in white, clutching the podium. She looked like a saint. I knew she was a monster. She was the one who had signed the checks. She was the one who had been my mother's best friend. She was the one who had hosted my 13th birthday party at her estate just a week before she had my mother killed. Richard was her attack dog, the public face of the business side of the charity. He was the one who handled problems. And I apparently was now a problem. The security guards were closing in, two beefy men in ill-fitting suits. They were the foundation's private security, not the museum's. They were on the Whitmore payroll. I knew their names. I had their files. One, a disgraced ex-cop named Miller, had a file thick with excessive force complaints. The other, his name was Michaels. He was the one who had been on the security detail at my mother's apartment building the night she died. My heart was hammering, not with fear but with a cold, precise rage. This was it, the moment. He was still holding the locket. "Give it back," I said, my voice quiet, subservient, the role I had to play. "Give what back, you little thief?" Richard sneered. He opened his palm and looked at the locket. He was drunk, trying to focus. "This piece of tin. You want it?" He laughed, a cruel barking sound, and dangled it over the broken glass. "Go fetch." He dropped it, my mother's legacy, my 15-year quest, my entire life's purpose, dropped into a puddle of champagne and glass shards. I didn't move. I couldn't. If I broke cover now, if I reacted, the entire 18-month operation was compromised. The SD card was shielded, waterproof, shock-resistant. It would be fine. But the violation. It was a calculated act of dehumanization. He didn't just assault me. He was assaulting my past. He was, unknowingly, desecrating the grave of the woman his family had murdered. He had no idea. He couldn't possibly comprehend what he had just done. He thought he was disciplining a disobedient server. He had no clue he had just, on camera in a room full of the wealthiest people in New York, committed battery, assault, and destruction of property against the one person who could link him, his aunt, and his entire board to Title 18, U.S. Code, Section 1961, the RICO Act. He had no idea he had just activated the in-person probable cause clause our AUSA had been praying for. He didn't know that my entire uniform was wired, that the third button on my vest was a 4K, wide-angle lens streaming high-definition video and audio to a federal server, that the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, 2 FBI agents, and a 20-man takedown team were sitting in a tactical van less than 2 blocks away, watching this entire thing happen in real time. Richard Whitmore, puffed up with his petty, borrowed power, turned to the security guards. "Get her out. And make sure she's not just fired, make sure she's arrested. I'll call the commissioner myself, have her thrown in a cell with the other animals." He turned and walked away, adjusting his tuxedo, laughing with a donor who patted him on the back. He thought he was cleaning up the party. He had no idea he just handed the federal government explicit probable cause for a public arrest. He had no idea he just gave me, personally, the legal justification to bypass his high-priced lawyers and put my hands on him. He just made the worst, and the very last, mistake of his entire, pathetic, and soon-to-be-over career. 48 hours later, we were in their inner sanctum. The emergency boardroom on the 50th floor of the Whitmore Global Foundation headquarters was a monument to wealth and paranoia. The walls were paneled in a dark, almost black mahogany that absorbed all light. The air was cold and recycled, and the massive, 20-foot-long table was a single, uninterrupted slab of polished black granite that felt as cold and dead as a tombstone. This was where the real power lay, far above the city, insulated from the noise, the grime, and the consequences of their actions. The incident, just as we'd planned, had gone viral, not because the press cared about a server, but because a donor's wife had filmed Richard's ghetto trash tirade and posted it, outraged. The foundation's PR team was in full-blown crisis mode. This was not a meeting about justice. It was a meeting about damage control. This was the competitor system closing ranks. Richard Whitmore sat at the head of the table. He wasn't the drunken, slurring brute from the gala. He was scrubbed, sharp, and sober, wearing a crisp $1,000 suit and a look of practiced concern. He was the very picture of aggrieved authority. He was flanked by his legal team, a phalanx of 3 sharks from the most powerful white-shoe law firm in the city. These were the fixers, the men who made investigations disappear, the men who had stonewalled our SEC subpoenas for 18 months. Beside them sat the foundation's board members, his competitors. They were all in on it. We had the financial traces. We knew they were all complicit, all signing off on the fraudulent documents, all taking their cut of the laundered money. They looked nervous, annoyed, their eyes darting between Richard and the woman at the other end of the table. And there she was, Eleanor Whitmore, the billionaire grandma from the title, the 80-year-old matriarch, the sainted philanthropist. She sat at the far end of the granite slab, her hands folded, her face a mask of practiced, grandmotherly disappointment. But she was here. She was here to protect the family name, to protect the empire. She was the final boss, and she was here to watch her nephew clean up his mess, and to ensure the family's interests were preserved. I was sitting in a hard, uncomfortable chair against the wall, yards away from the table. I was no longer an investigator. I was once again the help, the accuser. A lone, powerless HR representative, a nervous-looking woman in her 30s named Ms. Davies, was acting as the scapegoat, the designated mediator. She was visibly trembling, completely out of her depth, and her entire purpose was to legitimize this kangaroo court. Ms. Davies read from a script, her voice thin. "Mr. Whitmore, members of the board, thank you for coming. We are here to address the complaint filed by Ms. Vance regarding the incident at the gala. Ms. Vance, a temporary catering employee, has filed a complaint of assault and wrongful termination." She looked at me, her eyes full of pity, then quickly looked away. "Richard, the board needs your official version of events for our public statement." This was it. This was the villain's trap, the platform we had built for him. We needed his official, on-the-record lie. Richard leaned into the sensitive tabletop microphone, his voice a performance of pure, practiced sincerity. "Thank you, Ms. Davies. Thank you, members of the board. I'm glad we're here to clear this up." He sighed, a deep, sorrowful sound. "It's a tragedy, a genuine tragedy." He looked at me, his eyes dripping with fake concern, a look that made my skin crawl. "The girl, Ms. Vance, she was clearly intoxicated or high. We're not sure which. She was unstable. She was seen harassing our donors, grabbing them, begging for money. She became violent, aggressive." He spread his hands, a gesture of helpless benevolence. "I stepped in. I did what any of us would do. I stepped in to protect our guests, to protect Mr. Harrison, who, as you know, is one of our most cherished donors. I tried to calm her down. She tripped, she fell, she was hysterical. And now," he shook his head, his voice filled with a deep, profound sadness, "now she sees a payday. It's just heartbreaking." The lie was perfect. It was broad, it was comprehensive, and it was designed to paint me as an unhinged, drug-addicted, gold-digging animal. It was the exact narrative his lawyers had crafted. One of them, the lead counsel, a man named Harris, smoothly chimed in, his voice like silk sliding over steel. "Frankly," he said, addressing the board, "this is a classic extortion attempt, a shakedown." Ms. Vance sees the Whitmore name and her eyes turn into dollar signs. She's playing the victim card. He used the trigger word, and I saw a few board members nod. She claimed discrimination when, in fact, she was the aggressor. We have 25 witnesses, donors, staff, who will attest that she was unstable, that she was belligerent. Richard picked up the thread. She's just trying to deflect from her own behavior. This happens all the time to people like us, as you all know. Another sympathetic nod from the board. This was the echo chamber of the elite. They were all in agreement. I was the problem. I was the vermin who had crawled into their pristine home. Richard, now believing he had the full, unwavering support of the board and his aunt, performed his final act of dominance. This was his peak arrogance. He leaned back in his chair, a look of magnanimous, kingly authority on his face. He looked directly at the terrified HR rep, Ms. Davies, and then at me. "Look," he said, his voice now firm, decisive, the benevolent leader. "I don't want this to be ugly. It's bad for the foundation." He waved a dismissive hand. "Pay her." Ms. Davies cut a check. "Give her 20 grand, 30, whatever, just get her to sign an NDA and disappear." He paused and his eyes hardened. The mask was off. "And make sure she's blacklisted. I don't just mean from catering. I want her blacklisted from every hospitality group in the state. I want her ruined. I want her unable to get a job waiting tables at a diner. Am I understood?" Ms. Davies just nodded, her eyes wide, scribbling notes. He was in an official, recorded meeting admitting to conspiracy, to illegal blacklisting, to witness tampering, and to coercion. It was more than we could have hoped for. He then looked at me, a final, dismissive glance. "You should take the deal, girl. It's the best you'll ever get. You'll be a fool not to." He smiled. It was the wink. It was the final nail in his own coffin. He had just handed us on a silver platter the final evidence we needed for the obstruction of justice charge. He had no idea. He couldn't possibly know that his official version of events was a federal crime. He couldn't fathom that the kangaroo court he had assembled was, in fact, a federal deposition. He thought he was closing a loop. He had no idea he was tightening the noose. Richard Whitmore settled back in his chair, a small reptilian smile playing on his lips. He had done it. He had lied, slandered, and conspired to illegally blacklist me, all in an official capacity, and his board of co-conspirators had nodded along. He had dismissed me. In his mind, I was already gone, a $20,000 problem that had been solved. He turned to his lawyer, Harris, and they shared a quiet, knowing chuckle. The billionaire grandma, Eleanor, at the far end of the table, even gave a small, tight-lipped nod of approval. The machine was satisfied. The vermin had been handled. The HR representative, Ms. Davies, looked at me with a pathetic, pitying expression. "Ms. Vance," she stammered, Do you accept the Foundation's generous offer?" I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just looked at Richard. I let the silence stretch, a new, heavy, and uncomfortable thing in this cold, sterile room. The board members began to shift, their confidence wavering. Richard's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of his Galenite annoyance. "What?" he snapped. "Cat got your tongue, did you not hear me? I said take the money. Or what, you want more, is that it? You want 40. I almost smiled. This was the moment. I slowly, deliberately reached into the pocket of my cheap server's jacket. I pulled out my phone, not the burner phone I'd used to apply for the job, but my secure, federally issued device. I tapped a single button on a preset app. It was a signal, a go command. A half-second later, the double doors of the boardroom, the heavy, soundproof mahogany doors, swung open with a violent thud that echoed off the granite table like a gunshot. They didn't just open, they were thrown open. Richard Whitmore shot to his feet. "What the hell is this? Who authorized?" His voice died in his throat. I stood up from my chair against the wall, and I walked toward the table. I was no longer Amara, the server. I was Amara, the hunter. Flanking me, entering the room with a cold, grim, and unstoppable purpose, were two men. They were not in uniform. They were in dark, perfectly tailored, conservative suits. They were the apex predators of this ecosystem. One was Thomas McAllister, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. The other was Agent David Chen, the FBI's lead on the Joint Task Force for Financial Crimes. "What is this?" Richard sputtered, his face, which had been so smug, now a mask of pure, bewildered panic. "Security, I had her blacklisted. How did she get in here? Get them out." My voice, when it came, was completely different. The quiet, trembling, subservient tone of the server was gone. What came out was the voice I used for depositions. A voice that was cold, flat, devoid of all emotion, and echoed with the absolute, unshakable authority of the federal government. "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore." It wasn't a request, it was a command. Richard flinched as if I'd struck him. "You can't talk to me like that," he shrieked, his voice cracking, going high-pitched. "Who the hell do you think you are?" The board members were frozen, their faces a comical tableau of horror. Eleanor, the grandmother, had gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. I walked past Richard and stood at the head of the table. I placed my secure device on the granite. "I am lead investigator Amara Vance, Securities and Exchange Commission, Division of Enforcement, file number 800-174832. I unclipped the federal ID from my belt under my jacket and tossed it onto the table. It spun, coming to a stop right in front of him. "I am the lead agent on the multi-agency task force, including the SEC, the FBI, and the SDNY, that has been investigating your foundation for securities fraud, wire fraud, and racketeering for the last 18 months. The U.S. Attorney McAllister spoke, his voice a deep baritone that filled the room. "This meeting," he announced, "is now a federal deposition. Everything you have said has been recorded. Everything you say will be used against you." Richard's lawyer, Harris, finally found his voice. He shot to his feet, his face crimson. "This is an outrage. This is harassment. You can't just barge in here. This is corporate intimidation. You have no proof of any wrongdoing. We will have your badges for this." I looked at him, not at Richard, but at his lawyer. "Proof," I said, my voice clinical. "You want proof? Let's start with your official version of events." I turned my gaze back to Richard, who looked like he was about to be sick. "You're right, Mr. Whitmore. This is an extortion attempt. Your entire charity," I put the word in verbal quotes, "is a 15-year, $500 million extortion and racketeering scheme." "That's a lie," Richard screamed. "A baseless, slanderous lie. You have nothing." "Nothing," I replied, my voice still calm, still flat. "Let's start with 48 hours ago. At the gala, you testified just now that I was intoxicated, high, and harassing donors. You testified that I became violent and that you stepped in to protect your guests. You then claimed, and your counsel supported, that you have 20 to 25 witnesses who will attest to this version of events. Is that a fair summary of your official statement?" Harris, the lawyer, stepped forward. "My client has given his statement. We have nothing more to say." "Oh, you'll want to hear this," I said, "because while you were busy giving your perjured testimony, my colleagues were busy finalizing the affidavits from your 20 witnesses." I tapped my portfolio, which I had left on my chair. Agent Chen retrieved it and placed it in front of me. "It seems your donors have a slightly different recollection of events. We have affidavits from 27 individuals, including Mr. Harrison, the man you claim to be protecting, stating that you were the one who was intoxicated, that you were the one who initiated the unprovoked physical and verbal assault, that you threw me to the ground." I let that sink in. Richard was shaking his head, his eyes wide. "Liars, they're all liars. The security footage. The footage will show. It will show I was right." "Ah, the footage," I said, clicking a pen. "Let's talk about the footage. You see, we know you, or rather your private security team on your orders, erased the museum's CCTV footage from the ballroom. A clear violation of 18 U.S. Code, Section 1519, obstruction of a federal investigation. You thought you'd scrubbed it, but you're sloppy, Richard. You're an amateur. You deleted the on-site DVR, but you missed the hotel's redundant cloud backup, the one they keep for their insurance provider." I pulled a small, silver flash drive from my pocket. It was the first receipt. "This," I said, holding it up, "is the full, uncorrupted 4K high-definition footage of the assault. The footage that shows you grabbing me, shoving me, twisting my wrist, calling me ghetto trash and vermin. The footage that directly contradicts the sworn testimony you just gave, not 5 minutes ago, to a federal officer. The footage that, when combined with your testimony, constitutes felony perjury. Richard Whitmore's face went ghost white. The color didn't just drain, it fell as if a plug had been pulled. The competitor board members were no longer frozen. They were whispering frantically, their hands shaking, their phones vibrating on the granite tabletop. They were looking at Richard, not with support but with pure, unadulterated hatred. He had brought this on them. The U.S. attorney stepped forward. "That footage," he said, "is what we call a predicate act. It's the final piece we needed to move forward with the RICO indictment against every single member of this board." Harris, the lawyer, was shattered. "RICO, you can't. That's for the mob." "And what do you call this?" I asked, my voice rising for the first time, cutting through his panic. "A 15-year conspiracy to defraud the public, launder money, and bribe officials. You're not a foundation. You're a criminal enterprise with a good PR team." Richard's realization was complete. He wasn't in a damage control meeting. He was in an interrogation room, and he had just, with his own arrogant words, confessed. But the real pivot, the one that mattered to me, was happening at the far end of the table. The billionaire grandma, Eleanor, was staring at me. Her face was not just white, it was a mask of dawning, unidentifiable horror. Her mouth was slightly open. She wasn't looking at Richard. She wasn't looking at the U.S. attorney. She was staring at me, at my face, as if she was seeing a ghost. She was, I realized, she just didn't know whose. Richard Whitmore was sputtering, his mind completely broken, unable to process the catastrophic shift in reality. His face was a waxy, purplish red, and his hands were shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the granite table. You're a Fed, you tricked me, you set me up. This is entrapment," he shrieked, his voice a pathetic, watery echo of the man who had bellowed vermin at the gala. His lawyer, Harris, was just as shattered, his mouth opening and closing but no sound coming out. He was a shark, but he had just been hit with a torpedo. He knew the legal definition of entrapment, and he knew, with a sickening certainty, that this wasn't it. This was just a masterfully executed sting operation. I didn't even look at him. I dismissed him with a glance. "It's not entrapment when you're a violent criminal, Mr. Whitmore," I said, my voice cold. "It's just Tuesday." My focus, my entire being, was now aimed at the far end of the table. I walked the length of that granite slab, my footsteps the only sound in the room, a rhythmic, purposeful click-clack on the marble floor. The board members flinched and leaned away as I passed, as if I were radioactive. I stopped directly in front of the matriarch. I stopped in front of Eleanor. Richard, desperate, tried one last time. "Aunt Eleanor, Auntie, don't listen to her, she's a liar, call the commissioner, call." "Shut up, Richard," I commanded, my voice cutting him off like a garrote. I never took my eyes off the old woman. "You're not the one I'm here for, not really." I looked at the U.S. attorney, McAllister. "He's all yours, get him out of my sight." McAllister nodded to Agent Chen and the other FBI agent, who moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency. They didn't rough him up. They didn't need to. They simply flanked him, each taking an arm. "You can't arrest me," Richard wailed as they began to lift him. "You're not under arrest, Mr. Whitmore," Agent Chen said, his voice a polite, terrifying monotone. "You're just being detained as a material witness in a federal investigation, for now." They escorted him, stumbling and weeping, out of the boardroom, the heavy doors slamming shut behind him, leaving a vacuum of stunned silence. Now it was just me, the board, the lawyers, and her. All eyes turned to Eleanor. She was trembling, but her eyes, unlike Richard's, were not panicked. They were sharp, analytical, and full of a cold, dawning horror. She was staring at my face, at my eyes, at the structure of my jaw. She was seeing a ghost, and I was about to give that ghost a name. "I'm here for her," I said, my voice dropping back to that clinical, flat tone. "And I'm here for my mother." I unclasped the broken silver chain from around my neck. The locket, the cheap, tacky thing, was heavy in my hand. I didn't toss it. I didn't slide it. I placed it on the black granite table directly in front of her. The small, metallic sound was as loud as a cannon shot in the dead silent room. You recognize this, don't you, Mrs. Whitmore? Alina's breath hitched. Her hand, frail and covered in liver spots, hovered over the silver, afraid to touch it. She didn't need to. I knew she recognized it. It was a custom piece. You gave it to her, I stated, not a question, a fact. You gave it to your dearest friend, your chief accountant, Sarah Vance. I let my name hang in the air. Vance, the name from the HR complaint, the name she had just heard. I saw the connection fire behind her eyes, the logic clicking into place like the tumblers of a lock. Her face, already pale, turned to the color of ash. I'm Amara Vance, I said, completing the circuit, Sarah's daughter. And then the final thunderbolt reveal. The one that turned this from a financial crimes investigation into something far darker. I'm the daughter of the woman you had killed 15 years ago, just 2 days after she threatened to expose you for this. I swept my hand across the room, at the board, the lawyers, the entire fraudulent empire. You didn't just kill an employee, Alina. You murdered my mother. The boardroom exploded. It was a detonation of pure systemic shock. Harris, the lawyer, found his voice. Murder? This is insane. This is a fabrication. You have no. Sarah Vance's death was a suicide. It was ruled a suicide. It's a closed case. The other board members who had been nervous about fraud were now in a state of primal terror. They were screaming, literally screaming. Murder? We had nothing to do with that. I wasn't even on the board then. Oh my God, oh my God. They were scrambling, grabbing their phones, their Blackberries, their briefcases. Nobody moves, McAllister, the U.S. attorney, boomed, his voice rattling the windows. This is now an active federal crime scene. Agent Chen, secure the room. No one leaves. No one makes a call. Agent Chen and the other FBI agents stationed themselves at the door, their hands inside their jackets. The panic subsided, replaced by a thick, unbreathable dread. This was the suiting up. This was the transformation. For 15 years I had been the orphan, the survivor, the quiet, invisible girl in the system, fueled by a single, burning purpose. For the last 18 months I had been the undercover agent, the server, the nobody. Now in this room I was the executioner. I walked to the head of the table where Richard had sat. At the front of the room was a massive 80-inch smart TV, dark and silent. I plugged my federally issued device into the HDMI port. This was my armor. This was me putting on the robes. The screen flickered to life. It didn't show spreadsheets. It showed my credentials, my shield, blazing on the screen. AMARA, VANCE Senior Enforcement Counsel, SEC Division of Enforcement. And below that, the title of the investigation, the one I had personally named, the one that had been sealed by a federal judge until this very moment. Case file, 800-174832 in Ray, WHITMORE Global Foundation, racketeering, SECURITIES fraud and homicide. Alina Whitmore stared at the screen. She stared at my name. She stared at the word homicide. She finally understood. She, the billionaire grandma, looked at me, the black girl, the vermin, and she finally saw who I was. I was Sarah's daughter, and I had the proof. Her eyes, those sharp, intelligent, reptilian eyes, were now wide with a terror that was almost biblical. She wasn't just facing prison. She was facing me. Suicide, I said, my voice quiet, turning back to the lawyer, Harris. That's the official story. The story your client, Mrs. Whitmore, paid for. A $2 million illegal transfer to the city coroner who missed the defensive wounds on my mother's arms and the signs of a struggle. A coroner who missed the fact that my mother was right-handed, but the suicide note was written by a left-handed person. Harris was shaking his head, his face slick with sweat. Circumstantial, baseless. You can't prove any of this. I can, I said, and I will. I looked at Alina. She was staring at the locket which still sat on the table. Her dearest friend Sarah, my mother, the woman she had hugged at my 13th birthday party, the woman she had ordered killed less than a week later. She knew what was in that locket. My mother had told her. She had warned her she'd made a copy of the real ledger. She had begged her to come clean. Instead, Alina had her thrown from a building. And now, 15 years later, that ledger was back. It was in her boardroom. And the daughter of the woman she'd murdered was about to read it to a U.S. attorney. This was the real hug. It was the past, reaching out and squeezing the life from her. She was finally, after 15 years, getting hugged by the ghost she thought she had buried. You can't prove any of this. Harris, the lawyer, was still sputtering, his professional mask shattered, revealing the panicked, complicit rat underneath. It's baseless, circumstantial. You have a locket. This is theater. It's not evidence. He was appealing to the U.S. Attorney, McAllister, who just stared at him with a look of bored contempt. McAllister knew what was coming. I had saved the deconstruction for last. I let Harris's voice echo and die in the vast, cold silence. The other board members were frozen, trapped between the FBI agents at the door and the federal prosecutor in the room. They were rats in a very expensive, mahogany-paneled trap. I turned my attention back to the old woman, back to Alina. She hadn't moved. She was just staring at me, her eyes drilling into mine, as if she could destroy me with the sheer force of her will, the same will that had built this fraudulent empire and murdered my mother. For 15 years, I began, my voice quiet, conversational, every word a hammer blow, you thought you got away with it. You thought you threw my mother from that building and that was the end. You thought her daughter, the 13-year-old girl you just hosted a birthday party for, was just collateral damage. You thought I was just some orphan lost to the foster care system, a non-person. You didn't count on me. I began to pace slowly in front of the smart TV, my federal credentials blazing on the screen behind me. This was my resume. You didn't know I'd get a full academic scholarship to Stanford. You didn't know I'd graduate summa cum laude. You didn't know I'd go to Yale Law, where I made editor of the Law Review in my second year, focusing on one thing and one thing only: white-collar crime and complex securities fraud. You didn't know I turned down a $450,000 signing bonus from the same white shoe law firm you employ, I nodded at the horrified Harris, to take a $60,000 a year government job. You didn't know I spent the last 7 years at the Securities and Exchange Commission, climbing the ladder, building this case, running this task force just to get into this room. I'm not just an investigator, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm a bloodhound. I am the direct and legal consequence of your actions, and I have been hunting you my entire adult life. I stopped packing. I turned to the empty chair where Richard had sat. Your nephew, I said, my voice filled with disgust, called me vermin. He called me ghetto trash. He said I didn't belong in his ballroom. I turned my gaze back to the terrified board members. He was right. I don't belong in a room with thieves, racketeers, and murderers. I then looked at Alina. I'm here to clean the room. I walked back to the head of the table. I picked up the locket. Alina flinched, her eyes locked on it. This, I said, holding it up, is what you and your coroner missed. You thought it was just a piece of jewelry. You didn't know my mother was smarter than all of you, that she was a brilliant accountant who knew when she was ordered to cook the books that she'd need an insurance policy. She knew you'd come for her, so she made a copy, a perfect, pristine, uncorrupted copy of the real ledger. I opened the locket. It wasn't designed for a picture. It was designed for one thing. With a long fingernail, I pressed a nearly invisible clasp. The silver face popped open, revealing not a romantic engraving but a tiny, custom-molded cavity. And nestled inside was a single black microSD card. This, I said, is my mother's final gift, her last will and testament, the original uncorrupted ledger. The one you thought was on the laptop you had your security team recover from her apartment. The one you thought was destroyed. I walked to my laptop, which was already connected to the 80-inch screen. I slid the microSD card into a waiting adapter. I clicked a file. The screen flashed. The SEC credentials disappeared, replaced by a spreadsheet. The screen split into two perfect, devastating columns. On the left, in green, WHITMORE Ledger Public Filing Form 990. On the right, in blazing red, VANCE Ledger Private Uncorrupted. Let's begin, shall we? I said, my voice the only sound. Let's start with the event you were celebrating 48 hours ago, the centerpiece of your humanitarian efforts. The screen highlighted a line item on the public green side. Donation $100 million, recipient, Global Health Initiative Sudan Hospital Project. $100 million, so generous. The press had loved it. But that's not where the money went, was it, Alina? I clicked the mouse. A red line shot across the screen, connecting that $100 donation to the real ledger entry on the right. And the recipient was not a hospital. The recipient was WHITMORE Offshore HOLDINGS CAYMANISLANDS ACCT 45AE. The transfer was for $98 million. You didn't just launder the money, I explained. You kept a 2% fee for the service. You weren't just building a hospital. You were washing blood money for your real clients, who we'll be speaking to next. The board members were hyperventilating. I didn't know. One of them, a woman named Clara, shrieked. I was told it was a legitimate project. You were told, I shot back, not even looking at her. Or you were paid, I clicked again. The screen shifted. The public ledger showed a series of consulting fees paid to each board member, ranging from $50,000 to $100,000 a year, modest for a billion-dollar foundation. But the real ledger, I said, shows the real payments. The red side lit up like a Christmas tree, monthly, structured six-figure payments to each of them. Not to their domestic accounts, but to shell corporations in Panama, the same ones we'd been tracking for a year. And the memo line on each transfer was the same. It wasn't consulting. It was one word: retainer silence. You weren't a board, you were a conspiracy, McAllister, the U.S. attorney, said quietly, his voice full of disgust. You were all accessories to fraud. Harris, the lawyer, was on his feet. This is inadmissible. It's fruit of a poisonous tree. You can't prove that ledger is real. It's fake. She faked it. Faked it, I said. It's a perfect bite-for-bite reconciliation of your entire 15-year operation. It matches every hidden offshore account, every shell corporation, every single wire transfer the FBI and Treasury Department have spent the last 18 months uncovering. It's not fake, it's the key. It's my mother's final testimony. I turned back to the screen. But you're right, this is just fraud, it's just money. Let's talk about the real price. I clicked again. The screen changed. It was no longer a ledger. It was a single line item, a wire transfer from the foundation's discretionary fund. The public ledger showed a $2 million anonymous donation to the Police Benevolent Fund in City Coroner's office. So charitable. But the real ledger, I whispered, tells a different story. The red line connected it to a direct, untraceable wire transfer. Not to the city, but to the personal offshore account of one Dr. Alan Farah. Dr. Farah, I explained, was the city coroner who, 15 years ago, ruled my mother's death a suicide. The coroner who missed the defensive wounds on her arms. The coroner who missed the signs of a violent struggle in her apartment. The coroner who missed the fact that my mother was right-handed, but the suicide note found on the scene, a note we now know was forged, was written by a left-handed person. A board member actually fainted, sliding from her chair to the floor with a soft thud. No one moved to help her. And now, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper, for the final receipt, the kill shot, the one you, Alina, thought was burned. I clicked one last time. It was no longer a spreadsheet. It was a scanned, encrypted internal memo. A memo my mother had intercepted and copied to the SD card. It was from Alina's personal email account, sent to her head of security, a man named Michaels, the same man who was at the gala, the same man who had been at my mother's apartment the night she died. The memo was dated 2 days before her death. The subject line was chillingly corporate. Subject: Advanced Problem Resolution. The body of the memo was 3 sentences. Containment has failed. She refused the offer. Move to permanent solution. Plausible deniability is paramount. E.W. E.W., I said, staring at the old woman. Alina Whitmore, a signed digital kill order. The room was in total collapse. The board members were in hysterics, crying, screaming, begging, pointing fingers at each other. She told me it was just a tax write-off. I never knew about the murder, I swear to God. The lawyers were silent, their careers vaporized. They were no longer lawyers, they were co-conspirators, but Alina was not crying, she was not screaming, she was rigid. She stared at the screen, at the memo, at her own initials, and then she looked at me. Her face was not a mask of remorse. It was not a mask of terror. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated reptilian hatred. She had been beaten, and she hated me for it. The room was a symphony of collapse. The board member who had fainted was being attended to, not by her colleagues, but by an FBI agent who was checking her pulse with a look of bored irritation. The others were weeping, hysterically, babbling to the agents. "I'll testify. I didn't know. She made us do it." A pathetic, chaotic chorus of rats deserting a sinking, burning ship. Harris, the once mighty lawyer, was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, his career and his freedom evaporating in real time. McAllister, the U.S. attorney, had his phone to his ear, his back to the room, calmly authorizing the arrest warrants for the coroner, the security chief, and the off-site financial team. The machine of justice, so long stalled, was now moving with terrifying, unstoppable speed. But all of it was just background noise. The only thing that mattered in the world, the only two people who existed, were me and her, Alina, the billionaire grandma. She was still standing, rigid, her knuckles white on the black granite. Her breathing was shallow. She was staring at the kill order on the screen, her own initials, EW, glowing like a neon sign. And then she spoke. Her voice, unlike the board's, was not a hysterical shriek. It was low, guttural, and trembling with a rage so profound it was almost elemental. This was the final speech. This was the cornered matriarch, the she-wolf, making her last stand. "You," she whispered, her voice a venomous hiss. "You arrogant little child." She looked at me, her eyes, which had been wide with shock, now narrowing into slits of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You've destroyed everything." She didn't mean my life. She meant hers. "All of it," she suddenly screamed, her voice cracking, "all that good work. All that charity, I saved thousands of lives, we built hospitals, we funded research, we did good, real, tangible good, and you come in here with your petty, little revenge, and you burn it all to the ground. You would sacrifice the future of thousands just to settle your own insignificant 15-year-old score." She was trying to reframe it even now, trying to paint herself as the righteous one, the utilitarian, the one who made the hard choices, trying to paint me as the villain, the one destroying the world's savior. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I met her gaze and I delivered my own verdict. "Good work," I said, my voice cutting through her tirade, silencing it instantly. "You didn't do good work. You used good work as a shield. You used charity as a high-priced laundry service to wash your blood money. You didn't build hospitals. You built an empire on the bodies of whistleblowers and the stolen donations of good, trusting people. And you call my quest for justice petty." I took a step toward her. She flinched. "You murdered my mother in cold blood. You threw her from a balcony and left her 13-year-old daughter to find the body. You stole 15 years of my life. You let your nephew call me vermin and ghetto trash for sport. And you have the audacity," my voice finally rose, "to stand there and lecture me on the greater good." That was it, the final verbal blow, the truth, and it broke her. The rage, the hatred, the magnificent reptilian arrogance, it all shattered. It didn't just fade, it evaporated as if it had never been. And all that was left was a terrified, frail, 80-year-old woman, her face crumpled. The strength went out of her legs. Her eyes, which had been so full of fire, suddenly filled with the hot, pathetic tears of pure, abject terror. She saw the cell. She saw the end. "No," she whispered, her voice now a childlike whimper. "No, no, you can't." And then she lunged. It wasn't an attack. It was a plea. Before I could react, before Agent Chen or McAllister could move, she lurched forward, stumbling around the corner of the table. She broke down in sobs, a horrible, retching sound, and she grabbed me. She wasn't just grabbing me. She was clinging to me, her arms wrapping around my waist, her manicured fingers digging into the fabric of my suit jacket. She buried her face in my stomach, hugging me in a grotesque, desperate, and horrifying embrace. This was the hug from the title. It was not a hug of love or recognition or remorse. It was the hug of a drowning person trying to pull their rescuer under with them. It was the hug of absolute primal terror. "Please," she wailed, her voice muffled against my clothes, her tears soaking through my shirt. "Please. You can't. I'm an old woman. I was your mother's friend. Please, you'll kill me. Don't do this." I stood rigid, my entire body recoiling, my hands up, as if she were covered in filth. I was disgusted. This was the woman who had signed my mother's death warrant. This was the woman who had just called my life's work petty. And now she was clinging to me, begging me, her grandmotherly facade now a weapon of last resort. "We can make a deal," she sobbed, looking up at me, her face a grotesque mask of tears, mascara, and terror. "A deal, please. I'll give you everything, the money, the foundation. All of it, it's yours. It should have been yours. Just call them off, call them off. Tell them you made a mistake. Please, Amara, please." I had waited 15 years for this moment. 15 years of nightmares, of foster homes, of grinding my way through a system that was designed to make me fail. 15 years of imagining what I would say, what I would do. And here it was. The billionaire grandma, the untouchable goddess, reduced to a weeping, begging child clinging to my waist. I grabbed her, not gently. I grabbed her by the frail, expensive fabric on her shoulders. I ripped her arms off me, breaking her grip. I shoved her back hard, holding her at arm's length. Her frail body stumbled. I held her up, my fingers digging into her bones, forcing her to look at me, forcing her to see the face of the woman whose life she had destroyed. My voice was a whisper, a final, lethal gavel drop. "A deal," I whispered, the word full of all the acid and rage of 15 years. "My mother begged you for a deal. She begged you for her life." I let go. She didn't have the strength to stand. She collapsed, a heap of expensive silk and old bones onto the marble floor. She just knelt there, her body heaving, her cries now silent, gasping, defeated. I looked at McAllister. He just nodded, his face grim. He'd heard the confession. He'd seen the plea. He gestured to Agent Chen. I smoothed my suit jacket, the spots where she'd wept on me feeling like a stain. I turned and looked down at the pathetic, crumpled figure on the floor, and I gave her one last, final order, twisting the knife of her nephew's own words. "Agent Chen," I said, my voice clear and cold, "she's all yours. Get this vermin out of my sight." Alina Whitmore was arrested. There was no dramatic perp walk for the cameras, no public spectacle for the evening news. McAllister's team was surgical, professional. They took her, and the entire complicit, weeping board down a private freight elevator, a quiet, ignominious and sterile end to a 50-year reign of terror built on lies. The billionaire grandma, the sainted philanthropist, was processed not as a pillar of the community, but as a flight risk and the head of a criminal enterprise. Charged with conspiracy to commit securities fraud, 24 counts of wire fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, and most damningly, conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, she was denied bail. The judge, citing the overwhelming and irrefutable evidence of the kill order and the extreme risk of flight and danger to the community, remanded her to federal custody. Her empire, built on a mountain of lies in my mother's body, had been decapitated in a single, sterile boardroom meeting. But the takedown was not just about her. It was about the entire corrupt ecosystem that had enabled her. The ripple effect wasn't just a wave, it was a cleansing fire. Alina Whitmore, facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence, the uncorrupted ledger, the digital kill order, and the combined, desperate, and immediate testimony of her entire board flipping on her to save themselves, was fast-tracked for trial. She never showed a moment of remorse. Even on the stand, she maintained her sociopathic narrative, that it was all for the greater good, that my mother was a single, regrettable necessity to save the work of thousands. The jury, comprised of everyday citizens, deliberated for less than 20 minutes. She was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. She died 6 months later, alone in her cell at a maximum security federal penitentiary in upstate New York, not of a cardiac event, but of an overdose. The official report ruled it a suicide, the same lie she had manufactured for my mother. A dark, fitting, and final piece of justice. Her name was stripped from every building, every scholarship, every hospital wing she had ever graciously donated to. She wasn't just imprisoned, she was erased. Richard Whitmore, in a desperate, weeping, and pathetic plea for leniency, testified against his aunt, the board, and the entire financial infrastructure of the foundation. He detailed every fraudulent deal, every bribe, every threat he had ever made on her behalf, in exchange for his full and complete cooperation, and for information that led to the recovery of an additional $200 million in hidden offshore assets. He received a reduced sentence, 25 years. He would be an old man when he got out, his name forever synonymous with the very trash he so despised, a cautionary tale whispered in the same elite circles that once worshipped him. The competitors were systematically dismantled. All 12 competitor board members were indicted. Their personal assets, every penny of which we proved were the direct proceeds of the fraudulent retainer silence payments, were seized by the federal government under the RICO statute. They received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years for their roles in the conspiracy. The message to the corporate world was clear and immediate. Silence is complicity, and complicity has a price. The entire corrupt infrastructure that had supported the Whitmore machine, from the bribed city coroner who had falsified my mother's autopsy, to the security chief Michaels who had carried out the murder, was rooted out. Michaels, facing his own first-degree murder charge, confessed, detailing the entire horrific night, how he and another operative staged my mother's suicide. He received life in prison. The coroner was sentenced to 10 years for obstruction and accepting a bribe, dying in prison as well. The foundation itself was the subject of the largest asset seizure in SEC history. The Whitmore Global Foundation was dissolved by the federal government, but the money that had been stolen from well-meaning donors, was not lost. The Department of Justice, in a landmark ruling, clawed back over $1.2 billion from the Whitmore offshore accounts, the seized assets of the board, and the family's personal holdings. This money was used to create a new, legitimate public trust, managed by a federally appointed independent board. Its sole mission: to fund the actual charities, the real hospitals, and the legitimate research that the Whitmores had used as a cover for 15 years. The new trust was named by its new board, the Sarah Vance Whistleblower Fund. And in Washington, the impact was permanent. The Sarah Vance Act was passed by Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support. It enacted the strongest and most sweeping whistleblower protections in United States history, creating new criminal penalties for corporate retaliation, and establishing a direct, anonymous, and shielded reporting line straight to the Department of Justice, bypassing corrupt internal corporate structures entirely. My mother's death had finally, 15 years later, created the very systemic change she had died trying to enact. And me, I didn't take the promotion McAllister offered me. I didn't stay at the SEC. My hunt was over. My mother's name was cleared. Her death was officially and very publicly reclassified by the state of New York as a homicide. She was honored posthumously by the president in a Rose Garden ceremony with the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her courage and integrity. I stood in the garden, surrounded by agents and politicians, and I held the medal. I had done it. It was finished. I left the SEC the next day. I used the money from my mother's recovered estate, the money that had been locked away for 15 years, to do the one thing I had dreamed of since I was 13. I opened a small, quiet, and unassuming law firm in a downtown office, a nonprofit. We don't take cases, we take causes. We represent, pro bono, whistleblowers, victims of corporate fraud, and employees facing illegal retaliation from untouchable employers. We are, in effect, a private SEC for the powerless. We are the ones who take the cases no one else will touch, the ones where the fight looks impossible. We are my mother's legacy, made real, made permanent, and made dangerous to men like Richard Whitmore. They tried to murder the truth. They tried to bury it 12 stories deep. They thought that by killing the messenger they could kill the message. But they forgot one simple, immutable, and eternal fact. The truth doesn't die. It just waits. And sometimes it has children. Justice may be slow, it may be blind, but in the end it is relentless, it is methodical, and it always gets the last word. If you believe that no one is above the law, that no billionaire is too big to fall, like this video and subscribe for more stories where the powerful finally get exactly what they deserve. Comment below, what was the most satisfying part of this takedown? The ledger, the kill order, or the final hug?